Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, certified financial planner and owner of Elevation Financial. Thanks for joining me today. As always, glad you are here. Today we're going to talk about emergency funds. So what issues should I consider when establishing and maintaining my emergency fund specifically? So there's a lot of nuance in personal finance, a lot of rules of thumb out there, a lot of different methodologies, planning areas. So one thing that is no exception is your emergency fund. When thinking through your emergency fund, how big should it be? Where should it be located? How should it be used? What are factors going into it? So, your emergency fund is a safety net. It's meant to ensure you're prepared for unexpected events that could put a strain on your finances, losing a job, unforeseen medical expenses, stuff like that. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes into determining what the appropriate emergency fund should be for you. So today we're going to talk through some questions to ask that are not going to necessarily tell you what to do because I don't know your situation specifically on this podcast anyway. But we're going to talk through questions to ask to help you think through what an appropriate emergency fund might be for you. So let's start with a few questions related to monthly expenses. So first question, do you need to review what monthly expenses you need to cover should you lose a source of income? If so, you want to consider the difference between essential and discretionary expenses and the extent to which you'd like to cover both types of expenses. So for example, let's say you lose your job. Are you willing to cut out discretionary expenses and live only on essential expenses for a while? Or do you want to maintain the existing lifestyle you have and not cut any expenses out? That's going to make a difference in how your emergency fund is built. Next, do you need to review how many months worth of expenses are appropriate for you to set aside? You want to consider things like the number of household incomes in your household, the nature of the income, how stable, how predictable it is, what your personal risk tolerance is as well. How many months are you willing to go before expecting to replace that income, and how stable is the income in your household? Next, are there any upcoming life events like marriage, children, spouse returning to work, new sources of income like Social Security, pensions, annuities? So if so, you want to factor in any upcoming changes to those expenses or additional sources of income when you're establishing your emergency fund. So things like guaranteed sources of income might decrease the amount you need for your emergency fund. For example, again, pensions, Social Security, things like that. Next, do you own or plan to own a rental property? If so, consider factoring in additional expenses for rental-related stuff like repairs, utilities, vacancies, and use that rental income as well when factoring in your emergency fund. You might also want to keep a separate rental emergency fund just for rental property as well. Next, are you a business owner? If so, factor in additional business-related expenses. Depending on how your business is structured, your business might have its own emergency fund within the business. But if you're more informal, more of a sole proprietor doing things informally, you might consider using your existing emergency fund to supplement the business as well. Next, when it comes to unexpected expenses, are you concerned about unexpected expenses that could arise from damage, wear and tear of your property or vehicles, appliances, etc.? So if so, considering factoring in insurance deductibles, things like home, auto insurance, etc. Consider factoring in additional amounts of cash to keep on hand for repairs. For example, if you have appliances that are older, if your roof is older, if your vehicles are older, stuff like that. If there's upcoming probability that you're going to have issues with certain appliances or equipment or vehicles, and you look at your deductibles, you can use that to factor in what your emergency fund should look like as well to cover those things. Are you concerned about expenses that could come from unexpected health-related issues? Are there health conditions or health issues coming up that you would expect might strain your finances? If so, look at your medical insurance deductibles and out-of-pocket maximums when you're establishing your emergency fund and see how that might align with your emergency fund. Next, you need to review your elimination period or waiting period of your disability insurance policy. So the elimination period is how long it takes for your disability benefits to kick in if you need to use them. So consider if your emergency fund is going to be adequate to cover those living expenses while you wait for disability insurance benefits to start. Are you concerned that it would be difficult to quickly replenish your emergency fund if you need to tap into it? If so, consider the flexibility of different assets or debt instruments. Again, I'm not a fan of debt, but you look at all different things sometimes. So do you have a HELOC? Credit card transfers, 401k loans, things like that. These things could be considered a backup emergency fund while you replenish your primary emergency fund. So see what sort of options you have with different accounts and instruments in your financial life that could be backup emergency funds. Is your emergency fund currently underfunded? Let's look at that. If so, consider whether you could optimize or sell certain assets or holdings to finish funding your emergency fund in the short term. But again, you want to be mindful of how those things might impact your investment or tax planning as well. So be careful about that. But consider ways you can quickly fund it if you need to. Next, is the majority of your emergency fund held in bank accounts like checking or savings? If so, consider whether the emergency fund could be better positioned in different account types, things like high yield checking or high yield savings accounts, or I-bonds, for example. I've talked about I-bonds in the past, potentially a place for your emergency fund. In that case, it keeps up with inflation, could be a feature. So take a look at the specific vehicles that your emergency fund is stored in. Does your employer offer emergency savings accounts as part of your retirement plan benefits? So for example, are you contributing to your account through work? Does it make it easier to fund your emergency fund because it's less friction just going out of your paycheck? That's one great way to fund an emergency fund sometimes. Is the majority of your emergency fund held in accounts or assets outside your bank? Things like retirement plans, brokerage accounts, things like that. If so, let's take a look. Is your emergency fund liquid enough? Does it have enough flexibility? Is it not penalty prone? How volatile is it? Do you need to add more stability? Should you move some of those funds into bank accounts or more stable liquid assets? Next, do you have an HSA, a health savings account? If so, maybe consider earmarking a portion of your HSA funds as part of your emergency fund to cover medical insurance deductibles or out-of-pocket maximums. That can be a supplement or a backup or a complement to your emergency fund. Also, do you have a Roth IRA? Not my favorite vehicle, but for this particular thing anyway, I love Roth IRAs. But for emergency funds, you could consider earmarking a portion of your Roth IRA's initial contributions because those are tax-free and penalty-free if you need to withdraw them. This could be part of your emergency fund, could be a backup emergency fund. Again, I don't love to advocate thinking of your Roth IRA contributions as an emergency fund, but in a pinch, it could be worth looking at holistically if the need is there. Next, you have permanent life insurance. Consider whether your policy's cash value could be earmarked as a backup or a part of your emergency fund as well. Do you have any safe assets that are currently illiquid but will gain liquidity in the future? For example, bonds, CDs, deferred annuities, I-bonds. Potentially earmark a portion of those assets as a future emergency fund once they gain liquidity. So be mindful of whether your current emergency fund is adequate or what you might need to do to bridge the gap. Next, is one of your financial goals to pay down debts? If so, you want to consider whether, how much you want to put toward paying off debt, refinancing, or consolidating, and how much that could reduce your monthly payments toward debt, and how that might complement your situation by reducing the demand on your emergency fund that might otherwise be needed. So can you restructure your debt in a way that would reduce the need for a higher emergency fund? Is one of your financial goals to make Roth conversions? Consider the extent to which Roth assets might complement your emergency fund needs by giving you more tax flexibility. Next, would any of your savings goals, like retirement contributions, 529, etc., be impacted if your current emergency fund were to be exhausted? So if so, consider prioritizing which savings goal should be cut or preserved if you do need to divert cash to replenish your emergency fund. So be mindful of additional planning benefits that might be affected if you do this. So, take into account like, hey, you have a 529, retirement plans, brokerage accounts, which one of these, what's the priority? Which one of these would you cut first if you had to replenish your emergency fund? So be mindful of those things as well. So those are some questions to ask as you are working on your emergency fund. Now, that was a lot we went through. So if you've forgotten all this already, the good news is this also is a blog post on my website with a download. The download is free. There's no email required. And if you go to the blog post version of this, which you can find on the podcast version, this is episode 201. So go to this episode on my website and you can click the link that says, hey, here's an article version. At the bottom of that, there's a PDF you can download that has a chart walking you through all these questions. So you can click and download the PDF, no email required, and you can use that as a reference if you want to kind of walk through these questions yourself to figure out if your emergency fund is adequate and what changes you might need to make. So I hope that's a helpful exercise to think through the questions that can help you determine if your emergency fund is adequate. And with that, as always, I'm always available for questions. You can reach out to me on my website, which is elevationfinancial.com. You're welcome to book a complimentary money session if you have any questions, or just reach out if you have a question through the contact form on my website as well. Always happy to chat. With that, have a great day. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next time.